Listening to the daily news or reading the newspaper brings us to realize again and again that we are in a difficult situation and not one in which we want to stay. It doesn't need to be spelt out for us. The arrival of the vaccine and the prospect of readjusting to life after lockdown and restrictions is attractive to us and keeps us going. Thus, as Lent meets us this year, it almost seems unnecessary for it to invite us into the desert. We are there already. We've become familiar with constraints and limits, sometimes feeling that we are those generations who have trod. There is, for us in this Lent, an opportunity to relate to the wandering people of Israel, to have a real fellow feeling with them in their long walking in a small space, in their wondering about their leaders, their being wistful in their recollection of better times in the past, their questions about who God is to them. We may well look forward to a time when we will remember this time of pandemic from a distance, and we may wonder at some point in future how we put up with it, and perhaps we will realize how it has shaped us. Lent invites us to recognize how we are being shaped, how God is working in us right now. The desert is offered to us exactly for that reason, because it is such an experience that forms and shapes a personality. We accompany Jesus to see what is happening in his heart and to allow our hearts to be similarly shaped. Lent's desert journey is not without relief. The temptations of Jesus point us to some of the pinnacles of his reflection and thought. They bring us to recognize how his humanity was most sorely tested. And we recall these events not to frighten ourselves or not as cautionary tales, but so that we might acknowledge the reality of similar tensions in our own lives. Like Jesus, we too are attracted by dreams of self-sufficiency, perhaps of popularity, to see how it would be easier for us to unhook our lives from responsibility and truth. Lent brings us each year typical catechetical gospels, stories that are instructive, narratives that teach us and reveal the heart of Jesus to us. We are invited to see him as fully alive to aspects of human experience. And we recognize him as someone tempted as we are, but someone who is wholly in touch with his identity and relationship with God, perhaps not so much as we are. The Gospels of the first two Sundays of Lent typically bring us the stories of the Transfiguration and the Temptation. They invite us to see how these realities that Jesus experienced are alive in our hearts as we accompany him in our desert experience of Lent. These stories set us on a course to appreciate more fully the meaning of the resurrection, the meaning of God's being fully present and alive to us, and prepare us to receive the good news in our lives, in our time. Just as the people of Israel would look back on their time in the desert as a time of growth in appreciation and a deepening understanding of God's purpose, we look back at these stories of temptation and transfiguration not to recall the details, but to recognize how in our lives the Spirit of Jesus is calling us to take heart, to stand, to remember our dignity. This is what we mean by calling them catechetical. It's not an activity of educating the mind or refreshing details. It's an invitation to discover how the events described echo in us, how they find a resonance, how they set up a harmony. Catechime. So it's more than reading a headline and coming to a succinct conclusion. The invitation to us is to journey and to grow in wisdom, to linger with these events and to see how they invite us to life. We recognize the connections between our lives and the life of Jesus, between our experience and his. And we learn how to align our hopes, our desires, with what God hopes, desires, and offers to us. Of course, we would like our difficulties to end as soon as possible. That goes without saying. But when we find ourselves in an enduring or prolonged situation or condition, the opportunity for us then is to look around and to grow in wisdom rather than simply to resist and complain. Instead of looking back wistfully or straining to look ahead, we see what is happening where we are. We discern how God is moving and meeting us where we are. We recall the Transfiguration in a way that is more than remembering a historical event. Like the people who journeyed in the desert, their experience became meaningful and formative of every generation since. Similarly, we can return to the story of the Transfiguration to recognize our own experience, to be invited into an aspect of the truth of our own lives, so that something of our own lives may become more evident to us, that we may value something that often lies just beyond recognition. The Transfiguration begins with an invitation to be with Jesus in his prayer, to come and see, to abide a while in his company. Mark tells us that Jesus was accompanied by Elijah and Moses. We can immediately see how Moses relates to the experience of Jesus and his time in the desert. Moses, as the leader of the people, established the people in following the way of God. And for us to pray in the company of Moses is to be in the presence of somebody whose following of God was not always certain, who, much as he recognized God's presence and led his people into new freedom, was also somebody who tripped up, who resisted, who had hesitations and wondered about how God could be active in barren and bleak and contradictory circumstances. The Transfiguration is an opportunity for us to take time with him and to look at his faltering steps and to take encouragement, as ours don't always seem to get us where we would like to go. Elijah, too, will reward any attention we can give him. For the people of Israel, on leaving the desert, the Passover meal would be their great recollection, their annual remembering and bringing back into their own lives the story of their people. Part of the Passover meal in our time is to recall that there is an incomplete company, as one place at the table always remains empty, the place setting unused, the portion untasted, as the empty chair is left for the prophet Elijah. The Passover meal that Jesus celebrated may not have had these practices, but Jesus certainly understood what it was to leave the door open in the hope of a better world. He would have known why a child would go out searching for the missing prophet. These elements of the contemporary Passover hold out for a world without slavery or injustice or hunger, just as Jesus did. So Elijah appears in times of trouble. He is one who brings relief to the needy and hope to those in despair. If we find ourselves feeling disappointed or shortchanged or not fully as we would like to be, we need to think only of that empty chair and who might occupy it. As Elijah asks us to sharpen our attention to what blessing awaits, we are more likely to make space for that change in our lives, in our hearts, and to recognize it by naming it, instead of letting it pass us by. Our prayer now is the same as that of the people at the Passover meal, that God may send us Elijah the prophet to comfort us with news of our deliverance, as our door stands open and our table ready to receive him. So here is Jesus in the presence of Moses and Elijah. What is it like for us to spend time appreciating them, to listening for the truth that they may bring to us, for recognizing and naming the blessings that we have received and those for which we hope? Peter's spontaneous reaction is, "It is good for us to be here." Before we think of his words, we might think about who is speaking. Peter, a figure held in great reverence in the church. Last week we celebrated the feast of the chair of Peter, recognizing his teaching authority, his position of leadership, his being first among equals in his role of guiding Christians in faith. In faith is to say that there is something more to Peter than meets the eye. Peter is the one who said to Jesus, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." Or we might remember him as the one who doubted and sank beneath the waves. We can recall that Jesus spoke strongly to him, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." We recognize him as one who distanced himself from Jesus in his suffering. And so we know all of this about Peter and mark these moments in their turn. But we balance all of them with the truth that complements them and makes them whole. In each case, the attitudes, the words, and actions of Jesus caution us against coming to judgment and dismissing this fragile, strong man. It is tempting when Peter is present to become cynical and to see his fragility echoed in the world or in the church around us. Instead, when Peter is present, we may hear an invitation to see ourselves, to acknowledge our own weakness, difficulty, and doubt, and to hear the words of Jesus addressed to us with love. It is good for us to be here. Can we say that? Can we join Peter? Saying it is good is to name blessings, to recognize something positive. This may sometimes seem a little wearing and can be an effort if we find ourselves having to wring out of ourselves a reason for gratitude or some cause for appreciation. But asking the Holy Spirit to help us is to review our lives and to see where there are gifts, and to name again what are gifts that we may have come to think of as entitlements. If we feel we have a right, then we're not going to be grateful. If we have a right to be online, a right to a computer, or a right to go and use YouTube, then there's little to be grateful for. But we can see that recognizing and naming gifts helps us to realize that we are blessed already. Peter says it is good for us to be here. And his "for us" is a reminder that he's not there on his own. He is speaking for himself, but he's always in relationship. He's always addressing himself to Jesus and conscious of his connection with others. As he comes to pray, as he's in the presence of Jesus praying in this gospel, he's not there alone, he's in company. Our prayer will always be enriched when we remember that we never pray alone, but always join with the whole communion of the faithful in praying with them and for them, even if separated and temporarily apart. finding ourselves separated from others means that we have to make a little more effort to be present with others in prayer, perhaps online, perhaps keeping that awareness as we come to pray ourselves. We're not reminded as easily by the fact that there is somebody near to us or within sight or within hearing. So we make that act of generosity in keeping them in our hearts as we pray, in drawing support from the community that is present, even if not visible. And Peter, in saying it is good to be here, perhaps invites us to be here, to be where we are, that our prayer would always begin where we are situated. We look back with a sense of gratitude and an awareness of the blessing that we have had, but not so that we can rewind and avoid the present. Our culture has many ways of inviting us out of the present and into the past. There's nostalgia and cosmetics and deferral of aging and avoidance of death, and all of them make it difficult for us to be where we are when that moment is not inviting. Or we may try to fast forward to a more secure future and imagine what it would be like to be somewhere else. Jesus responds to Peter, not in rebuke, but inviting him to look further. And Jesus himself hears an affirmation of his time of prayer, of his presence and relationship, as he hears the voice say, "This is my Son, the Beloved." And to the disciples, the invitation to listen to him, that invitation to us. The disciples realized that they were in the presence of mystery. Mark describes the cloud that surrounds them, the cloud recalling all those times when God's way was present yet hidden. We may train ourselves to enjoy clarity and definition, data and certainty, and so this cloud is not a welcome place. We can easily confuse the fogginess that may be sometimes in our own thinking with the cloud of God's presence. But this gospel then helps us by remembering that we are invited to be present with Jesus in prayer, present to wonder. We discover the difference between assurance and certainty, between trust and self-confidence, as we hear, even in the cloud, the voice of God affirming relationship, inviting deep attention. Jesus' prayer was always about his relationship with God and entering more fully and deeply into it. His response to Peter is not to contradict him. Sure, he doesn't want the booths to be built, but he doesn't want to stay there just because it's nice for Peter. Nor does he leave or rebuff Peter, but he travels with him. He prepares Peter for the bumpy road ahead and assures him of his presence, assures him that he will be with him. As Jesus told Peter and the other disciples not to speak about what they have experienced, perhaps we can hear an invitation to reflect and to pray and to consider carefully what is happening within us, not just around us. Bringing what we notice before Jesus, remembering that he invites us to pray with him and to be just as he is, in dialogue with Moses and Elijah, is so that we may be encouraged both by our memory and our hopes. In this Lenten journey, let us hear that invitation again, to step aside at Jesus' word, to join him in meeting with God, to be blessed in what we remember and in what we hope for, but to be where we are in the company of Jesus, who helps us to move into our lives, accepting that we are messengers of God's presence through the word given to us, through what we hear in our hearts.